Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile, Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
Hello again, and it is true. I am your intrepid host, Peter Robbins. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. And if you were watching last week, you did not see a live show. You saw a rebroadcast of an interview conversation I had with a dear friend of about 20 years, Mr. Richard M. Dolan. It was actually one of both of our favorites of all the shows I've done this year, in part because we were able to have a lot of fun. And in fact, we grew up fairly close to each other and have spent a lot of time together the last years. It was a good show to go out on. And the last show that I did for, how quickly we forget.
KGRA.
Yes, my KGRA, my old radio network, digital broadcasting. And this, of course, is my first show on KUNX Digital Broadcasting Network. Over the years that I was there, I learned a great deal. And I want to take a minute to thank the people that really made it possible. Owner Warren Braga and his son Eric, my longtime show producer there, Bill Skywatcher, and more recently over the past year or so, my absolutely brilliant producer, Chanel Lamb. Also, and not without some irony, I want to thank my first producer at KGRA, Mr. Race Hobbs, who by a wonderful quirk of fate is now my producer again. The wheel comes full circle, Mr. Hobbs. And it's very exciting for me to carry my show over here. I expect that I will get to watch my show grow as this extraordinary network expands as well. And for the first show of the year, I couldn't think of a better first show of the year, the first show of this new incarnation of Meanwhile Here on Earth. I could not have had a better guest than the one who was kind enough to be with us today. And that is Chief Sean Cahill, who served in the United States Navy from 1995 until 2015. Sean was entrusted with critical missions spanning anti-terrorism, anti-piracy, interrogation, and investigations. Chief Cahill retired from the United States Navy in 2015. He is a co-founder and strategic advisor of Skyfort.org, a think tank and tech incubator that's focused on the UAP issue until closing its doors recently after congressional hearings were achieved. Sean continues his work today as an advisor to two startups centered on understanding unidentified anomalous phenomena and reducing the harm around the ontological shock that often follows in-depth studies on interaction. He has shared his experience and perspectives on platforms like the History Channel, Discovery, major news outlets, and podcasts. Cahill's journey embodies both a rich service history and a humble pursuit of understanding the mysteries that intrigue us. In 2004, while serving on board the USS Nimitz, Sean was one of those naval personnel who became a witness to more than one account of what the world now refers to as the Tic Tac UFOs. And Sean Cahill, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's really good to be here, Peter. It's so good to see you again.
Yeah. After some awareness of each other for a certain amount of time, we finally got to meet and spend time together this spring. at the terrific Ozark Mountain UFO conference. And although, again, we didn't get to spend much time together, it was great beginning to get to know you there.
You too, Peter.
One of the things that makes this show format a bit different than other shows is it often springs from a childhood question, which has informed a lot of the programs that I've done, especially on a one-to-one basis, which is how people in public life who we look to, admire, don't admire, follow, are interested in, how they became the people that they are. And that usually means starting at the beginning, the way beginning. Sean, where were you born?
I was born in Atlanta, Georgia in May of 1973, the youngest of 8 children, the World War II vet and his wife. I was born rather ill, 3 months premature and cesarean.
Oh boy.
My chest had not finished closing, and I believe that my skull hadn't finished either. And I suffered a great deal of issues while in the hospital. My heart stopped a number of times, and the doctors went to my parents and basically said, he's not going to make it. They'd actually brought the family priest in. So I had last rites before I'd even been baptized.
Oh my gosh.
But I was lucky enough that they had a program at Emory University where they were working on experimental techniques with incubators and zero pressure bubbles and things like that. So I was medevaced to Emory, where lucky enough I survived and thrived rather against the odds that the doctors gave my parents.
I'll say, I don't think I've ever met anybody who received the last rites before being baptized. It's traditionally in the other order, as I recall.
Yeah, it's a little weird.
That's an amazing start. Was your dad in the military?
Yes, my father.
I mean, not just serving in the war, but a career?
Actually, no. Funny enough, I always equate his enlistment to the name of his aircraft, which was Duration in 6, because that's what all of the guys had signed up for, was the duration of the war plus 6 months. So the 6 months following the end of the war, my father worked for the OSI or the OSS in Berlin, mopping up the remaining Nazis that were holding out.
Did he talk to you about that at all growing up?
You know, of all of my brothers and sisters, everybody had told me before that he'd never talked about the war and stuff, but I lived alone with Dad for about 5 years, and I was very interested in the military. And he did here and there, and then eventually ended up giving me his photographs from the war and stuff. He had it's a scary story actually for a lot of people, and it was for me when I was a child. But he had for a long time. We had a dagger that was memorabilia. Some of the few pieces of memorabilia left. There had been an incident when I guess my mom had put his footlocker out for the trash, and I think he had taken the boys to the dump to look for it, and it was never rescued. But one of the few pieces of memorabilia that survived was a very imposing Nazi dagger. It was an SS dagger, actually. And when I say imposing, it was the size of a gladius. It was a very large knife in a self-sharpening scabbard, covered with filigree and words and inlay, and if not for who wielded it and what it meant, it was a beautiful piece of art.
Sure.
But when my dad brought that out for the first time, I said, "Where did you get it?" Thinking he was going to say something like Berlin or Munich or in a shop or from a buddy. And he said, "Well, I took it off of an officer, a Nazi officer." And he paused and then said, "And I used it to kill him." Because he wanted me to be sure that I knew, that I understood what I was looking at and what he had to go through to get it. I don't think until I really got a lot older and, had lived a life that I really understood what that might have done to him. First of all, whether it was by necessity or I don't believe that my father encountered that kind of thing in most of his time in the service. I know that he'd had a harrowing time in the bomber. Had survived 29 missions over Europe. They had bombed Ploiesti and Peenemünde and other really important areas where a lot of folks didn't make it out, which was where he ended up subsequently becoming a Foo Fighter witness during his time. So it's an interesting chain of events for my father to have had his time in service the way he did and to encounter the things he did, and then for me to end up on Princeton at the same time as the Tic Tac event in 2004.
Exactly. Did your father talk to you at all about the Foo Fighters?
A little bit. When I had an interest in UFOs as a child, and I had an interest in anything that had a B-17 aircraft in it. So the movie, I have to say, if I can fast forward to him, shortly before he died, I got him to see the Memphis Belle, and he was on the ground when they landed. He had arrived in England shortly before that, so that was kind of his introduction, and I was really glad that he got to see that again. So sorry.
The romance of those aircraft for that first generation of boys like us to follow fathers who had served in the Army Air Corps informed a lot of the play part of our childhood. I grew up, perhaps like you, playing World War II with young friends or cowboys and Indians. Mm-hmm. And there was always one side that you didn't want to be on. Yeah. And at the same time, I didn't come from a family with a military background. Was that the case with your family, Sean?
No, my as far back as you can look, at least on my father's side, we've all seemed to have served, and our name descends from the original Irish was O'Cahill, the son of Cahill, a warlord. So we were known to be early on to be warriors, and later on priests and other things like that when that arrived on the island. But my grandfather served in World War I. And I hesitate to mention this, although I mentioned it at Ozarks, but I've lost my research on it. But he was present at the Somme during what was what amounted to a Tic Tac sighting or something, a unusual dirigible that moved very fast, at low altitude with escort craft. And I've lost my research on that, and it was very sparse.
Oh, ouch!
But one of my favorite stories about my grandfather that I uncovered with through Ancestry.com was finding not only my father's enlistment paperwork shortly after Pearl Harbor, a couple of days after, like many around him, he showed up as soon as he could to volunteer. But I had my grandfather's rejection. My grandfather was far too old for service, but apparently he was about 10 numbers away from my father in line before they told him, no, you're too old, and signed his ticket and sent him home. So I always really enjoyed that level of integrity. Yeah.
Yes, and how wonderful to have that document. That's amazing.
Yeah. That's I can just picture him just complaining through the whole war, knowing that he had something to offer and could have helped, or
For my dad, it was wanting to be in combat, and he tested high enough that they made him an instructor of this new technology called radar. So he was out of it, at the same time frustrated, at the same time, I'm sure like your dad and millions of other guys, knowing they were part of something much bigger than themselves and on the right side of history. Yeah. And as a result, living through an inspired and inspiring piece of time, in no way meaning to glorify or romanticize war. Right. As a kid, growing up, did you spend most of your time in a rural setting, suburban, urban?
Pretty suburban. I was actually born very well off. My father had succeeded a great deal following the war. When I described the level of wealth that well, he had gone from wrong side of the tracks, working 6 jobs, to someone who could afford 8 children and a house that could hold them properly and feed them, et cetera. So I grew up in the outskirts of San Francisco in a town called Hillsboro.
Oh my!
In the hills. And later I spent quite a deal, about 5 years in Palm Beach, Florida, before we returned back to California, to the Bay Area, where I lived until shortly before I joined the Navy.
When you were still in elementary school, did you take to reading quickly, or was it something like me that really took extra time? In my case, partly because of my dyslexia, or was the world of information primarily one that came at you through television and movies?
I didn't read well in school for a long time, and I don't know if it was the environment or not, but my mother would teach me to read from it was Keats, and it was Shakespeare and the Bible. And so I still have a love for all three, even though it was torturous at the time.
Wow.
I never caught on quick as a kid. I needed things explained to me more than once.
Yeah, me too. When were you much of a moviegoer as a kid, either being, on television, or did the family go out to the movies sometimes? Although that's a lot of tickets to get at one point.
The first 7 years of my life, I remember a lot of family events, a lot of mom and dad and everybody around. When I was 7, my mother passed away on Christmas.
Oh.
And after that, we kind of fragmented. My older brothers and sisters most of them, were past the age of majority at that point, and were beginning to spread their own wings and move out. So shortly after Mom died was when I began reading science fiction voraciously, and taking in as much anything to do with space or time travel or the weird. I loved movies. But I also, I had this thing I shared with my father that was this love of war movies and World War II movies.
Yeah.
The Dirty Dozen and Kelly's Heroes and Tora, things like that. All to a soundtrack that I grew up with that was Benny Goodman and Frank Sinatra. And so I grew up a little differently than my friends. So I lived a lot in entertainment.
May I ask you, I don't think there's anything to compare to losing a loving mother at a young age. Silly question in a way, how did that impact on your life and the direction it took? How did you deal with it at the time, Sean?
I accepted it. I was angry. My father made an unfortunately poor choice, but he was only human. When I asked him following the funeral, why did God, or why did Mom die? My father's faith as a Catholic told him to say that God needed Mom more than we did. And I couldn't imagine, and I still can't, how a 7-year-old might need a mother less than God needed her back. But as a 50-year-old man now, I understand how hard it is to give those answers. And I also understand, frankly, how much I've lost. It took a long time to try to learn about and gain back that piece of femininity.
Yes.
That I didn't have access to, that I didn't have an example of. So yeah, it's heavy, but that piece was definitely missing.
I think it was in Great Expectations at the end, and I, like so many people, was introduced to Charles Dickens' books, like so many other great authors, by seeing movies. And it's one of the great sources of inspiration for me as a reader from the time I was a kid. But it's one of the lead characters saying to the other one at the end of the narrative that the best steel goes through the hottest fire. Nobody needs or wants to grow from this kind of challenge there are other ways to grow and mature, but given your options, which were bloody few, we persevere and do the best we can, and in a way know that that's what that person that's gone would have wanted for us.
Yeah.
When and where and how did your original interest in the subject of UFOs begin? Was it with your dad or something else?
There was a vague interest in anything that I would call interesting, and something anomalous or beyond the earth. It would always interest me, but it wasn't until I checked out a book from the library at my elementary school that I think most of us that were alive and interested in the 70s and 80s will remember, that had a picture of the Loch Ness Monster, a picture of of kind of a German helmet type UFO with a pointy thing on the top. And I think there was a picture of the Patterson-Gimlin Sasquatch, and I don't recall the other one, but it was a pretty famous book. And I just remember being fascinated, absolutely riveted by the fact that these investigations had resulted in granted, I'm using adult language, but that there were people that had seen these things and reported them, and that everybody kind of went, nah. And in some cases, there were photos. Now, we know that some of those on there are now alleged to have been disproven. And of course, you and I have dealt with that for years, trying to, separate the wheat from the chaff.
Yeah.
But I was on the tail of an investigation, and I would come and go from it over the years. But it's something that has fascinated me since that first wealth of information was introduced to me, that there was a history, and that there were doctors and generals and people like that we would trust, that were talking about it. Even as a child, I felt like I could understand that this was something that was, some people were seeing the forest for the trees, and others were completely discarded. So
by the time you got to high school, Sean, had you decided, as we mystically used to say, what you wanted to be when you grew up, or still kind of looking at options? Or
I think when I was quite young, I'd wanted to be an astronaut or a writer or something very lofty without any training behind it. But I have to be honest and say that when the movie Top Gun came out, I knew that I wanted to be a pilot. And for a few years, I worked very hard trying to figure out what I could do at that age to become that thing, and had at one point even secured a promise of a letter of appointment from a 4-star general who was a family member, that if I had gotten my grades up to a certain point, he'd be happy to write a letter of recommendation and support me going to Annapolis. I don't blame not attaining that on my father passing, or actually, he got sick. He had what we thought was Parkinson's, which they treated wrong. They treated Parkinson's when in fact he had progressive supranuclear palsy. So we think that he suffered some microstrokes and suffered degradation due to that misdiagnosis. But it kind of, again, as I say, I don't blame it for it, but my response to how life went from academia and golf, which was all that I cared. I was trying to be a better student and be a better golfer so I could go to Annapolis, to guitar and girls and sneaking out and smoking cigarettes and things like that.
Did you zone in on the Navy as opposed to another service branch when it came time to enlist for a particular reason?
It's funny because I had always I always thought of the Navy as the senior service, even though my father was in the Army Air Corps, which we know it later became the Air Force. I had always idolized the Navy, but I have to be honest that when I went down to enlist, I had went down to enlist in the Air Force, and they were at lunch, and the Navy Marine Corps office was, and in fact the Army office, but I knew there was no way in hell I was going in the Army. I'd watched MASH and there, as a kid, and there was no way I was going to go do that. But I should have taken the cue that the Air Force took lunch and everyone else was working through lunch to make their quotas. So I walked into the Navy office and got suckered right in.
Literally, the Air Force was out to lunch, and the history of your life and the trajectory it was going to go on changed because somebody needed a sandwich really bad.
Well, I make a joke with a friend of mine. I was like, it was 50-50 whether I was going to become a UAP advocate or a man in black. So, sorry.
So, you enlist. Did you enlist at the location in Greater San Francisco?
No, at the time I was living adjacent to Disneyland, actually, in Southern California, and was working or actually hanging out at the time, not working, at a coffee shop. And there happened to be a recruiter across the street. And strangely enough, the day that I left for boot camp, I was sitting in front of the coffee shop drinking coffee with my friends, thinking I had another half an hour or something, and the Navy vehicle pulls out of the parking lot, sees me. They pull across the street, and they're like, "Where the hell have you been?" I was like, "We're not leaving till 9:30." They're like, "You were supposed to," just already yelling at me.
You're off to a great start.
Yeah.
Beginning with the sandwich, or the lack of a sandwich. Where did you do your basic training?
In Great Lakes, Illinois. During the winter time. I know that it got far below zero. I don't want to quote the number, but it was ridiculous in that we wore every piece of clothing that we owned when we would go to chow in the morning, to include rolled towels and ski masks and things.
Nobody told you that this part of the Navy would be winterized.
I didn't understand either why, living in Anaheim, they drove me to San Diego, and then where there was a perfectly good boot camp right there.
With nice weather.
Yes. And then flew. That's where I thought I was going, literally. I didn't know I was going to Illinois until we got down to the hotel and they started handing out plane tickets for the next morning. It really didn't matter because I was in the Navy now.
Yes, and you do what you're told. I'm trying to put myself in your place. Early on in your training, were you singled out, or how does it work that you are evaluated and ultimately either directed into one specialty area or another, or that you find yourself requesting it and either are turned down or accepted? How did that process go for you, and where did it take you?
So when I first went to the recruiter, one of the first things they do, if you have never taken what's called the ASVAB test, is they'll administer the test, and that kind of gives them a breakdown of where your skill set and cognitive set is. I had taken it in high school, but I hadn't taken it seriously. And so when I went to the recruiter, they only offered me with a mess management specialist, which is cook, or to go in as a non-designated seaman to become a bosun's mate. And I didn't understand because I thought I was pretty smart. And they broke it down for me pretty simply that, son, your scores are in the basement. And I was like, well, that's a mistake.
How could that be?
Well, because I basically just went like that and got the hell out with my day in high school. So they set me up for a new test, and I took it, scored in the high 90 percentiles. And then all fields opened for me.
Oh, interesting.
And initially, I thought I wanted to be a nuclear engineer. But a mentor of mine who was helping me go through the process once I'd picked Navy had been a nuke engineer dropout. And he'd explained to me that while I might have been smart enough, I just didn't come from the right part of society to get along with the uber. I mean, he said uber nerds. I just don't want to offend anybody. I'm quite the nerd myself. So he talked me out of it. And then I decided I wanted to go Navy SEAL, and he talked me out of that. And so I went to be I asked to be an intelligence specialist, and they checked my scores and all that was going to be fine. But they said I would have to go on 9 months of delayed enlistment, just basically hang around at home for 9 months until you can class up. And I was a musician at the time in and around Southern California with some folks that aren't with us anymore and some folks that are well known. And I wanted to get out of town. The music thing wasn't working the way I thought it was. And frankly, I was surrounded by drugs, and I had seen enough substance abuse in my life. to know better, to know that you needed to take the chance and get the heck out when you could. So I just said, okay, I'll take the non-designated seaman apprenticeship program. So I spent my first 3.5 years in Guam, cutting palm fronds and building barbecue grills and cleaning up after typhoons and earthquakes, and a few other fun things. I got to participate in Operation Pacific Haven, but that was when I applied for the Master at Arms program, what other people would know as military police.
I was going to say, yes, okay. And what, I mean, for a lot of people, it's simply understood, but what were some of the responsibilities that would fall under your domain once you were qualified to be a Master at Arms?
Well, in most services, in the other services, they would be called military police or security police. But in the United States Navy, you not only have those duties, but you also have the duty to what we call enforce good order and discipline on board the ship. And so that means naval regulations, naval law, courtesy, all of those things, whether it's haircut, shoe shines, the length of a person's nails, whether or not they're utilizing proper hygiene. The Master at Arms is there to ensure all of that occurs. Not only that, they serve as usually what's called the urinalysis coordinator, who plans, conducts, and sends off for analysis urine samples of the crew to ensure that no one's on drugs.
Yeah.
Depending upon where you are in your career, usually when you reach around Chief Petty Officer, you'll and some people at the E6 or Petty Officer First Class level might attain the title of Chief Master at Arms on board a vessel, where they, as a first class, it would be a title. For a Chief Petty Officer, it's not only their title, but their rank. But that goes all the way back to the age of sail. And the Master at Arms was the person who literally kept the arms on board under lock and key, would train the crew with them, and then break them out before, going to quarters. So a lot of tradition after the USS Cole and then 9/11, Master at Arms became anti-terrorism specialists. We took on a mobile and expeditionary role and expanded a great deal from 1,300 personnel when I became a Master at Arms to, I believe, over 15,000 today, to be one of the largest ratings in the Navy.
Wow.
So over the course of my career, I worked in anti-piracy operations in the Northern Arabian Gulf on the oil platforms, have done a bit of interrogation and quite a bit of law enforcement.
Let me take you back to 2001. And I completely transposed. You were on the Princeton 2004, not the Nimitz, correct?
That's correct. I was the Chief Master at Arms of the USS Princeton, but we were part of the USS Nimitz battle group. So for a lot of people, it's kind of splitting hairs. They don't, so.
What ship were you serving on in September of 2001?
I was actually stationed at Naval Air Station North Island on shore duty.
Okay.
And I had just finished a tour on the USS Constellation.
I want to take you back to September 11th, and this is purely personal. Most of us will never forget where we were on that day, but if you were in the military, it must have been very different. I was in Manhattan at the time, just a few miles from the location. Yeah. But how did you first hear about it? What was your reaction? And ultimately, how did that change the trajectory of your work in the Navy?
Well, I was safe here in San Diego. I too had family who worked in and around the area who luckily got out safe prior to any of the incredibly disastrous things that followed. But I had just gotten off of work. It was what I considered my weekend. I don't know what day of the week. I don't recall what day. It was Tuesday. It was my Friday. I was on a night shift, and so that was my first day off on a schedule. My wife was upstairs blow drying her hair or getting ready for work or something like that in general. And I'd stripped off my camouflage top, and I think I might have brought her a cup of coffee, poured myself one. I think I poured a shot of tequila because it was my Friday night. It was acceptable to drink in the morning when you're on the night shift, and brought that out in front of the television, and I turned on something entertaining that didn't have a news break. And shortly after that, the phone rang, and one of our neighbors, basically was like, "Turn on the TV, they're attacking New York." And she was a little bit of a hyperbolic person, so I kind of said, yeah, whatever. And then called up to my wife while explaining it to her. And as I turned on the television, I don't know if it was live or on replay, but I saw one of the planes hit the tower, and I went cold. I had just received, I was working in anti-terrorism on a base
already,
and had spent a couple of years working in it on board the USS Constellation, training with some folks that went on to just become amazing in our field. So I had great training. And the first thing that I thought was, well, if they've done that, then I imagine that the camera is going to cut to the Golden Gate Bridge and to the Coronado Bridge or to the Sears Tower. And I saw this, I thought we were truly under attack in a fashion like that would have been, I figured if this was anyone who knew Pearl Harbor had happened would never punch us again. They would strike us. So I didn't understand what I was seeing.
Yes, well said.
I alerted my wife. I had 2 bulletproof vests at home. I put one in her trunk, and I put an extra one, the other one in mine. And then I went out and I scraped off the DOD stickers on our car. I obviously went a little paranoid, but I didn't know.
Better to overreact.
I didn't know what I was going to face on the way to work.
Right.
And I didn't want to identify myself as a service member from 100 feet away if I could help it. I parked off base and I walked in. Luckily, we're security, so everybody recognized me and let me through. And I went straight to the armory and signed in and took over. And I manned the armory for about 12 hours. And during that 12 hours, held our chief of police for the entire Southern California regional area at gunpoint, because I didn't know what the hell he looked like. And he came banging on the cage, let me in. And I drew down on him and put him on the ground until he produced identification. I later on, after he got over it, ended up getting a commendation from him for doing that. But,
do you remember the first briefing that you had, an official Navy briefing, however soon after the attack on New York, and what you were told, or of what they could tell you, or what the tone was at that point?
I'm sure I'm melding a few days together here.
Sure,
but,
sure.
I watched a lot of my chain of command get fired immediately.
Wow.
It's hard to explain, but when I arrived at North Island with security, the master at arms were not in charge of security. Department of Defense civilian police officers and what we would call 9545s, and no disparagement on the folks who had that training. What it was temporary police training for people who did not normally have a lot of shore duty for places for them to go. They would farm them out to security. So you would have the bulk of your force would be other specialties doing it in a temporary fashion. So they outnumbered us a great deal. And our chain of command was not fond of the people who did it as a career. Within a few days of 9/11, my master chief, my senior chief, and my lieutenant were replaced. And I may be getting one of those wrong, but my chief, my first class, and myself were shoved into leadership positions. And suddenly we're told, well, you're the anti-terrorism guys. What do we do? And that was a local level at the time I was an E5. So that made sense. That looked huge to me from my vantage point there. And in the days that followed, we made it up as we went along. We were not ready to do 100% ID checks, pat downs, and bag checks for about approximately the 100,000 people that would come and go from that base each day. And so we backed the traffic up all the way across the Coronado Bridge. We had people that were so stressed out because of everything we were all going through, but basically losing their business while waiting in line to get to work, and starting fights with each other. And it took a couple of days to really calm that down. A lot of good folks that were doing no wrong got put face down in the mud at gunpoint, in and around the bases, because they were business as usual and things had changed.
At what point were you made aware, as well as any of us can be officially, who the enemy was, or who you were told the enemy was?
Well, here in San Diego, we were, it became really personal really quick for a lot of us. We found out very quickly from NCIS that as they were identifying the probable persons behind the hijacking from the videos at the gates and at the airports and things like that, we were told that they were local. Some of them were local here to San Diego, learning to fly. And it was shortly after, I want to say in October, when NCIS came to our precinct and interviewed many of us, because some of us, including myself, had personal contact with one of the hijackers.
Oh my gosh.
They were here in San Diego. One of the jobs they had was as a cab driver. And I responded to a call. I think it was the Nimitz, but it could have been a different carrier. I responded to a call at the carrier to escort a cab to the carrier to try to retrieve a fare that a sailor had bailed out on.
Sure.
So this was something that would happen once in a while. So I escorted him there and checked his identification, checked his, and he had also been checked at the gate, checked his placard. I was like, okay, the guy's a cabbie, and granted, this was pre 9/11, so we weren't on any kind of high alert. This was just another cabbie. Escorted him up to the Nimitz, inquired about the sailor. Nimitz says sailor does not exist on our roster. Okay, we're just assuming you got given a BS name, or I can't remember what the proof was, why he knew his name.
Would have been the name of the individual, most likely.
It was good enough for us to respond to the call and to take him up there. And so there no crew member by that name. Oh, well, you're out of luck. And we escorted him off base. Well, we found out later on that they were probing the bases, and that luckily every base had responded according to procedure, never left him, didn't give up until, once the transaction was finished, escorted off the base. So we got lucky that we had that, and not because of me, but they had. And what I'm saying is they probed all of our bases. So everybody involved did their job that day, and so they didn't choose the San Diego military complex as a target.
You were involved in anti-piracy work as well. Most of us have heard and followed news stories over the years of primarily Libyan-based pirates in the old school tradition, often involved in what really comes down to a shakedown or ransom, or just trying to get whatever money they need to keep doing their thing. What is the closest you got to actually interceding in an episode of piracy?
Well, out of 198 boardings that we did in the Northern Arabian Gulf during my last deployment with Visit Board Search and Seizure, we actually were lucky enough to it depends on how you call it lucky. I call it lucky because the SEALs are much better cut out for these missions than we were, even though we had received. So in 2004, the USS Princeton and the John Paul Jones sent 2 crews over to our training facility and basically received the first blue water regular Navy non-compliant visit board search seizure training. 2 24-man teams, one that I led and one that was led by another chief, were sent there and basically given a special warfare mission to regular guys because the SEALs couldn't cover that mission anymore. So we were lucky that the 2 times that we encountered major opposition, the SEALs actually saved the day. We actually deployed on both of those, but ended up peeling off when the SEALs entered the area of responsibility. So I got very lucky. But there were quite a few times that we did run off other pirates and run people out of the area. In the Northern Arabian Gulf during the war, there was a great deal of piracy within the Gulf itself, not only just around the Horn of Africa, but within the Gulf itself, surrounding things like fuel and supplies and other things like that were being stolen from Iraq and then sold on the Gulf to Iran or other fishermen groups or things like that.
In the time that you were stationed in that part of the world, you had shore leaves occasionally. Is there a place, a city, an area outside of a town, a country that particularly stays with you in terms of your feelings about or contact with the people, or locations that were ancient or in some other way compelling, memorable, and in an ideal world that you'd like to return to at some time?
I've been lucky enough to visit a number of places: Australia, Japan, Indonesia, all over the Persian Gulf and Africa. And I have found that people all over the world are welcoming. They are kind, good-hearted people in most cases. We, as Master at Arms, we were looked at as we needed to be just a little bit better than everybody else when it came to how squared away or professional we were, or how we acted out in public. But I have to say that everywhere I went, the people were kind. So when it came to something special, it was actually something that that shook me, that stuck with me the most, and that was when I flew into Djibouti from Ethiopia and saw the remains of so we had taken over an old Russian base there. And it was a multinational base, but the level of destruction of the local environment, the tire graveyards, the Russian military equipment junkyards, flying in was like flying over a post-apocalyptic war zone and seeing people moving throughout these piles looking for things of value. And when we got into the airport, it was kind of a regional affair outside of the military base. Mm-hmm. And then the ride through town was just incredible squalor. And I'd never seen anything quite like that. Usually on the edges of military bases, it's suburban. There's a lot of vendors. There's a lot of life, and there's a lot of economy. I'd never been to Africa before, and I saw something that I don't know if I didn't think it existed anymore. But it really bothered me.
Understandably. Important reminder that we should never, or in only the rarest situations, confuse in any way the people, the citizens of a country, with the individuals who happen to be governing it or in power over it at any given time. And unfortunately, we're conditioned to do that in many cases from the time we're young. I think that's one of the greatest gifts of traveling. Whatever the context, you meet people that were foreign to you with a capital F, unrelatable, from completely different parts of the universe on a certain level. Yeah. And that one initial contact where you establish some kind of cordiality that can hint at being a friendship, mm-hmm. Everything changes. And maybe that's one of the best parts of the coming of age experience that countless young men and women now experience in the military. Did you ever feel at any time in any of your work, Sean, again, not to over dramatize, but that your life was in danger and very real on the circumstances you were in, and you needed to change those circumstances.
Looking at the time, I didn't always appreciate it, and perhaps that was masking to an extent to make it through. I've never faced combat, but living inside of an airport that floats and moving back and forth in small boats with and the need for bulletproof vests and the need for weapons and things like that create an environment of stress. And I didn't appreciate words like inflammation or stress or anxiety when I was young. I was raised by a hard-assed group of men who had survived World War II, and my older brothers were lucky enough to miss out on Vietnam, but not all their friends, and so that the generation above me a lot of them were vets, and so I came from I think the last of the unenlightened folks who just muscled their way through all of this. Thinking that if you just try harder, yell harder, and look busier, that you will have achieved dad status, and at some point that will all get easy. It doesn't work out that way. You end up having the same heart attack dad has, and being the same, low key alcoholic, etc. So, you and I were talking about challenge and change earlier, and I like to say I'm at a point now where I understand the value of challenge and how it gives us the change that we truly desire.
Yeah.
But I'm still human, just as human as all those people I met all around the world. In every place that I went, I met humans everywhere I went.
Sean, you mentioned when you did start reading when you were young, you gravitated strongly toward science fiction. When you're in the military, it's work, or hurry up and get ready to not do anything quite yet. There is time for reading occasionally. Did you read for pleasure at all during the time you were in the Navy? And if so, was it science fiction?
Incessantly. Most of it was science fiction when I could get my hands on it. The first 4 years that I lived in Guam were kind of hard because we only had one bookstore on the whole island. It was before the mall and before the Target went in, and now it's kind of like going to mini Hawaii. They have everything you could dream of, but at the time there was, until the last 6 months of my tour there, Amazon didn't exist either, and the last 6 months it was purely a bookstore. And I remember it taking 2 weeks for a book of poetry that I had ordered to arrive. And I was amazed, flabbergasted that something had come from the States in 2 weeks. Different world now. But, I've always enjoyed nonfiction and history. If I want to learn about a subject, I will. I grew up with the whatever the most expensive set of Encyclopedia Britannica was at the time, with the beautiful plastic vellum, for the anatomy and everything. I would give anything to have that set back, or all that back, because the amount of information in it just doesn't seem to exist on the internet anymore. But I've never stopped reading. Now it's harder for me now that I'm older. I listen to a lot of audiobooks now.
Oh, good. Okay.
Ask GPT or things like that to summarize for me. But I never stop taking in information. It drives my wife crazy. She's laughing on the other side of the camera.
Honey, you have too many books. Please,
I've gotten rid of more books over the years than I have in the house by far. We've donated to the library over and over again.
Outstanding. We're coming into our last minute or so before we go to our break. Up to this point in your life, the early 2000s, 2001, 2, 3, let's say, had you had any kind of UFO sighting or any kind of UFO related event in your own life?
I had, and unlike now, I don't think I identified with it so much. They were strange experiences, and maybe they were UFOs. And back then, in the late 70s and early 80s, we just did not have any kind of apparatus. If you were in the mainstream and just a person to turn to as a child, there was no MUFON to think. You didn't work that way as a kid. But in my adulthood, and especially since that I've taken on this topic as
professionally,
as a crusade or as a mission in a lot of ways, I've been forced to go back and identify and acknowledge those moments in my youth. And so I had some very strange things around the phenomenon as a child. But it wasn't until one that really shook me was a sighting in high school, or just after high school.
And believe it or not, that's exactly where we're going to pick up in 4 minutes. Peter Robbins here with my special guest, Sean Cahill. Meanwhile, Here on Earth is the show, and we will be back in 4. Don't go away. And we are back on KUNX Digital Broadcasting Network. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth, our very first premiere show here on KUNX. And my guest is Master Sean Cahill, Master at Arms, United States Navy. And we were just about to go back to high school, but a very particular aspect of it. Tell us about this particular event involving a UFO and possibly a truly anomalous one.
So what was really strange for me about this event wasn't my memory of it. It was a few years back when I picked up the phone to call the other guy, the one other person that I remembered being there.
Yeah.
He was the drummer in our band at the time, and is an in-law kind of I think he's my cousin's sister's nephew's son or something like that. It's something very ridiculous, but technically we're family. And when I called him, the first thing he alerted me to was that there was another person in the back seat, a person that I had access to that I could call after that call, and that they had very different memories of the event than I did. Essentially what happened was we were in San Jose, California, at the bottom of the eastern hills, and near a road called Quimby, which goes up into the hills and towards where my sister's house was. And we were at the 7-Eleven playing video games and smoking cigarettes, and it was time to head up to the house and write some music and stuff because our the parents were out of town. You know, those folks weren't around, so we could make some noise. So we made our way up the hill, and about halfway up the hill, we saw what looked like a football-shaped green meteor, but moving incredibly. And when I say a meteor, it's just what we immediately assumed that we were looking at, and moving across the sky incredibly slowly, downward at about a 45-degree angle from right to left. And the weirdest thing was that it was spitting out these orange Buck Rogers type sparks, like these just ridiculous, seemingly like out of scale, if you know what I mean. Like almost as if you remember the old Buck Rogers models, when the stuff would come off the back and the smoke and everything, and you knew they were way too fat for the model, you know, but we were happy to have anything. It was a strange looking thing. But to me, we watched it go across the sky. We were amazed. We went back to my house and we wrote music that night. And I even have the songs, and I felt like they were written that night. He said that no. And in fact, I was adamant that we go over the hill and into the valley, and then eventually went up to Mount Hamilton where the Lick Observatory is. That we went all the way up there to the parking lot, went out on the lawn, and I got out of the car. And again, I have no memory of this, that I got out of the car and that there were orbs there, a number of orbs moving around us, and that I was running around with my arms up laughing. And then eventually I got back in the car and the orbs left and we went home.
About what time, day or night, was this, Sean?
I want to say it was around 10 o'clock at night, because I know it was before midnight.
Okay.
Because one of the guys that I thought I remembered being with at the house had to be home by midnight, and it was really inconvenient for the rest of us. So when I got off the phone with him, I was concerned that I was like, this isn't what I remember at all. And I actually thought he might have been full of it and yanking my chain and stuff.
Sure.
And so I made a second call to the guy who was in the back seat, and I didn't front load him with anything. And he just told me I was scared S-less. And I was in the back seat basically cowering while your dumb rear jumped out of the car to go see what these things were. And I was flabbergasted that he was the best man at my wedding. And we only lost contact during a brief period between, say, 1995 and 1997 when I entered the service. And we've seen each other a couple times a year ever since, spend Thanksgivings together and things like that. And I had no idea that we had never discussed this again. And we haven't discussed it a lot since, other than on occasion I will bring it up with him and go, that's what you guys remember, right? And he's like, yep. You know, and he'll just say yes. And he doesn't have the interest in the subject that I do, doesn't feel that he's a repeat phenomenon experiencer, for lack of a better word. But
sure.
That bothered me the most, was finding that out. It bothered me far less than the Tic Tac did, far less than seeing an oversized silent black triangle over my head.
Yeah.
The
fact that your memories don't match up with the person that's verifying them is, well, it's extremely disturbing. Mm-hmm. I've worked with a great many people who find themselves in that place. Mm-hmm. And I have incidents in my life, I think a lot of us do, where we do remember something in a certain way and then find out it didn't happen like that. Take us back a little earlier to the earliest times you feel you had a UFO related event, or you saw something that you felt might be a truly anomalous thing up there.
Going back the farthest for me goes to a strange Christmas time before my mother passed away.
So you're 6 or 5?
I'm assuming that it must have been, if I remember it, because I do remember other things from around that time. I remember my 6th birthday. I'd gotten some cool toys then, and I had good memories of that night. A lot of people were at the house. And Mom was there, so it's a memory I think I held on to a lot.
Sure.
And I don't have all my brothers and sisters around still to check with them on this, and I'm slightly estranged from some of them, whether through the tide of years or the topic that we're discussing.
Yeah.
But there was a weird Christmas where my sister came to my room, specifically to keep me in my room so I wouldn't get outside and see Santa Claus, because if I saw Santa Claus, I would ruin everything.
Oh.
She immediately gave away the farm, so to speak, by saying that, but and her words didn't match her actions or her behavior or her tone. But she said that the noise that we heard were our brothers on the roof playing jokes on us. And I heard people running on the roof, and I heard jingle bells, what I thought was jingle bells. But she was crying and she was upset, and I wanted to leave the room. And as a kid, I mean, I think I was 6. So if I was 6, she was 14. And I was going to fight her to get out to get what I wanted, and she restrained me. And I remember we ended up in with her back against the door to my room, with me kind of in whatever she knew to do as a headlock as a 14-year-old girl in the 70s. But we had older brothers, so she probably knew what a headlock was pretty well.
No doubt.
And it was emotionally charged. I remember the boogers and the tears and the sweat. And it doesn't make any sense to me. And there was that night, that Christmas was when I got this huge swing set in our courtyard. We had a courtyard. We had a very large home. But this swing set was made of hardwood. It must have had 1,000 bolts to it. I found
Oh boy.
So the level of hardware that was there, as a man who's put together swing sets, there's no way in heck that my dad and my brothers put that thing together overnight. Now, don't get me wrong, they could have, but they couldn't. They also couldn't have done it without me seeing it in the courtyard. So it couldn't have happened over the course of days. The entire thing is a mixture of memories. But I had been asked by some friends to sit down, and I'm a meditator. I have no problem going into a very contemplative state, and then once I feel that I've achieved that centered calmness, to purposefully bring a memory up and examine it a little bit closer than we might have if we were just sitting in our chair having a cup of coffee and reminiscing.
Yes.
And I was shocked at how much fear I was filled with. Just trying to go through that again. And I would be happy to sit down with a psych. It's not a priority of mine, but if there were a psychologist or something like, I can explain that, I'd be happy to hear the explanation. I'm sure that trauma-related events, the comorbidity between abuse and UAP, unfortunately, it's whatever this thing is. I know some people say it's a purely benevolent thing and no one should worry about it. But I and others have been scared witless when encountering it. Now, whether that's uncanny valley or something else, I don't know.
Basic human instinct.
Sure. So I was shocked because I have other memories that are strange or weird, but they don't come with the same visceral feeling when I try to call them up.
Two quick questions coming off of this. In more recent times, is your sister still with us, and have you tried to engage her to discuss this again years after the fact?
She's not, and I've only brought it up recently I brought it up at Ozarks for the first time, and I bring it up to expose the fact that I don't know what happened, and I don't indicate. I have I can lean in one direction as to what was running on the roof and what I wasn't supposed to see.
Sure.
And I can lean completely in the other direction, that I'm just mistaken about a swing set, etc. And who knows who yelled at my sister to go keep the kid quiet, but I say it because, as I said, that visceral feeling is something that scans across the board for other experiences.
In no way do I mean to promote or put down this discipline, but have you ever given any thought whether or not, for your own peace of mind or curiosity, would be interested in exploring this with a responsible, incredible hypnotherapist?
I would. I've went back and forth in my own mind over the years of the validity of that experience, or of that discipline. But I have to say that at this point, I've run out of avenues of investigation to gain further information about my own personal experience. Unless there's some secret file on me somewhere, which I don't believe there is. And if there was, I don't believe I'm going to get it slid across the table to me anytime soon. I would be very interested in that avenue. And in fact, a mutual friend of ours, Forrest, has offered to help me with that. But I'd love to discuss it with you later if you had.
Yes, absolutely. An event at some point followed on this memory where you were once again engaged in seeing or thinking about or feeling involved in some way with this phenomena. Can you describe that or give us an idea of what that was, Sean?
If you're describing, I had an event occur here at my home that I ended up writing a song about, that some people seem to get wrapped around the axle, that a person who had an experience can also be an artist and have a sense of humor. But
that's crucial.
I wrote the song to cope with the event because it's not a 20-year-old memory for me. It's very recent, and it occurred during the period of what I consider my modern open eye investigation of this topic. And that was following a unfortunate and alcohol fueled discussion that led to an argument with my wife. By my memory, we had chosen to divorce. By my memory, we were sitting on the kitchen floor in a very rational moment, a very sad one, but at the same time, just calm and abiding. And I felt the only way to describe it, as it has happened each time in my life, was a compulsion to stand up. I was compelled to stand up and walk upstairs. And when I got to the top of the stairs, as I said, the first thing I saw was, sorry, I laughed because the first line of the song is not quite accurate. But I got to the top of the stairs and I looked out the window and I saw what looked like a very common shaped UFO, kind of a fat oblong with a dome on top, but the entire thing seemed to be a dark metal, almost like iron, and it seemed to be covered with a verdigris or a type of sickness or something. Not unlike rust, but seemingly more organic, almost like lichen, like a very deep burgundy colored lichen.
What time of day was this, Sean?
This was probably closer to midnight or in the 11 o'clock hour.
Did you see it because it was self-illuminated, or was it on the ground, or were there lights on it? Do you remember?
It was illuminated by the glow of the sky, the regular ambient light from street lights and other things around.
Okay.
And I was shocked in my recollection of it as to just how much it looked like a UFO, if you know what I mean. It was just you could have drawn the thing yourself and someone would have known exactly what you were looking at.
Yeah.
And I remember yelling down to my wife that you got to come up here and see this. There is a regular UFO over Steve's house next door. And it was as if you had put a bus just 65, 100 feet, somewhere around there, over the house next to you, and you're just looking at it sitting there, but it's a flying saucer. So it was very visceral. Again, there was something that was, all of it was very real. But then as I looked to the right, I realized there's something in my right frame of view. And again, that's not scanning either. It doesn't make sense. And from my recollection, this is hard to say, but it was a horrific caricature of a gray. of large black eyes and sunken, sallow cheeks, an elongated face with a pointy chin. It was shirtless. I could see that it was emaciated. I could see its rib cage, and I could also see that it was covered with something that was akin to the same corrosion that was on the vessel. But pardon me if you hear my dog in the background.
Okay.
But at that moment, what changed was that I was overcome by rage, and a rage that I have no explanation for, other than the fact that its appearance was malevolent to me, that the entire thing was strange. But in my recollection, I reached for it through the screen of the window, pushed the screen out and put one hand around its neck. And once I had that, just pushed off out the window, off of a table with both hands around its neck.
Oh my gosh.
Aiming for the ground with it, knowing full well what was going to happen. I didn't care, and I used an expletive, but I said, I see you there, fella. And I went out the window, and the next thing that I recall is waking up in my bed. And it's a strange series of events and recollection, but the phone rings and wakes me up. I notice that my arms are underneath the covers, and I flip-flop this sometimes, but because I've changed what I do with the process since. Now I will put my arms wherever the hell I want to, but at the time I was keeping them in one position. I would never have the covers pulled up to my neck with my arms either in or out. I can't remember where they were. And they were in the opposite way. And I was in the center of the bed, which I would never sleep in the center of our bed. Even when my wife's gone, I don't. And the phone's next to me. I answered my hands must have been out because I remembered now just reaching and grabbing the phone. My wife's on the other end, and she says, "I love you." And I'm taken aback by it because my last memory is us deciding to get divorced.
Oh.
Then I realized that, strangely enough, a moment before I was laying face down in the driveway in a pool of what looked like, it looked brightly lit on the driveway in the cold. And I remember getting up on my elbow and getting up on my side and looking down and seeing that I had a pair of boxer shorts on. Well, the boxer shorts that I had on were a very specific pair that I never wear. They were a pair of my wife's boxer shorts that she had worn in college as pajamas. I had borrowed them probably because I didn't prepare properly for a trip or something like that.
Sure.
Ended up keeping them as a keepsake in the back of my drawer all those years. They're just regular guys' boxer shorts, but I would never wear those because they had buttons in the front that I couldn't stand. And I'm all of this is happening. I'm on the phone with her, and she says, "I love you." And I say, I love you too. And that was when I looked under the covers and I saw those boxers that I would never wear, and everything's got me saying WTF. And she says that I say, "What happened last night?" And she goes, "Well, everything you said, you were amazing. You just said everything I needed to hear.
Oh.
And you made me feel safe, and I love you." And I was like, "Well, I love you too." And I mean, I was happy to hear that, but that wasn't what I remembered happening last night. And a lot of people will say, "Well, it was alcohol fueled. It was this." You're correct. All of those things are mitigating factors. And I've greatly changed in the years, the amount of alcohol I consume and how I feel about it and my intent with it when I do encounter it. So I don't blame anyone who might think other things were involved.
Sure.
But for me, it is an aberrant experience from an otherwise relatively normal life. Those aberrant experiences stick out like thorns.
Talking about a relatively normal life, whatever claims you were able to make for that title, reality, everything changed in 2004 when you happened to be involved as a witness in what became known as the so-called Tic Tac UFO sightings on more than one occasion. I don't have to tell you that the reverberation of these events in December of 2017 were seismic and kind of a delayed reaction. And right now we're in the aftermath of it, what I would call the post ridicule factor, a post-ridicule period in the world of UFOs. Not that it's completely gone, but the articles that the New York Times published on December 17th by Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie Kean and Helene Cooper, all outstanding reporters and journalists with the Times, truly was paradigm shifting, an overused phrase that this is exactly what it was meant for. Can you take us back to that day when you got caught up in this moment in history, which is still very much having a daily impact on your life?
As many of us will never forget 9/11, I'll never forget the day that the New York Times article came out and I first heard the name Lou Elizondo. I was sitting on my deck meditating, and or just reading the news and having a cup of coffee, but I was out there because I had either just finished or whatever, and my phone rang from someone it didn't usually ring from. It was a friend of mine who was a Master Chief Petty Officer in the Navy, and he was stationed on a major aircraft carrier. And he called me to say, hey, man, that thing you told us all about in 2004 on the Nimitz is in the newspaper. And the gun camera footage you told us about is like screenshotted and you know, and it was all part of it. And I first got a cold feeling because whatever this was back, and I hadn't given it a great deal of thought in a long time.
Yeah.
Even though in 2005 I had my Black Triangle sighting, and a couple of years later saw something pretty interesting on the way to Catalina on the ferry. Those just somehow always got pigeonholed as, oh, well, that was weird. And I have to say that, and this has been cherry picked by people who want to present a certain belief. And so I'll put the caveat that I don't believe this anymore. But in 2004, after the way that our chain of command responded, I was pretty sure that this was a DARPA program, because I took their stigma and their response to whomever took the radar tapes, that this was at a captain and admiral level. Maybe this was business as usual. Maybe they were aware of programs I wasn't aware of as a chief, and I was a new chief only for a few months. And then afterward, the fact that it never got reported, never leaked, nobody else was courageous enough to call Art Bell or something like that, and I certainly wasn't going to. I never thought I was going to deal with it again. So the first thing I did was come inside scared and showed it to my wife. And I said, what do I do? And she's like, what do you mean? I go, well, I was there. And I said, not only was I there, I mean, I worked with Kevin all week, Kevin Day, you know, getting the ship pointed where it needed to be. And we were talking back and forth, and, you know, so-and-so with the radar, and, you know, and then I saw something out there. I said, what do I do? And she's like, you know, we sat on it for about 5 days until I finally came to my wife and I said, I don't want to be a UFO guy. I don't want to be a UFO witness. I don't want a
public person in this.
I didn't really want the call back, but I wrote Lou Elizondo I found a address for him at TTSA. And I wrote to him and I said, my name's Sean Cahill. I was stationed on board the Princeton in 2004 as the Chief Master at Arms, and I was present on board the bridge for the events around the week of November 14th when we encountered the Tic Tac. If you need help vetting personnel, verifying crew, or if you need to verify any details, please feel free to reach out. And that was it. And I was like, well, I've done my due diligence now. I feel like I've done my part. And 9 months later, I got a call back from Lou. And within a matter of a couple of phone calls, we realized that we could certainly communicate with each other in a good fashion. And then he invited me to film an interview for a small thing that he was putting together at the time. They came to my house, they interviewed me, and then they found more folks that were involved with the event. And that turned into 2 seasons of Unidentified on the History Channel. And so I was lucky enough to go with Lou down to Mexico later on. But I digress into or I guess that's not digressing if you go into the future. But it changed everything for me. It put me on a path that I never intended to go on, and took me off the path that I'd kind of promised my family I'd be on. And I think that's a thing that a lot of people don't understand, is that a lot of us that you may not have seen 5 years ago aren't here to be rich or anything like that. We took a hard right turn in our life to help with something that we thought had value, just like everybody else. But I can't turn my back on it based on my ability to recall this specific event, that we can't let go of it the way we did with Roswell and 100 other, verifiable incidents.
Taking a stand, basically, and drawing the line in the sea, is not the dirt. Can you take us back to that day where it all began in 2004, when you were living your life on board, doing whatever you were doing, and either looked and saw something, or attention was called to something? Or how did this begin on that morning or that afternoon?
I had accepted an offer by my department head, the navigator, to stand watch on the bridge. I say that jokingly because I didn't need to stand a watch as the chief master at arms, but he didn't have enough young officers to fill the watch bill, and all the other chiefs stood watch. And so he gave me the opportunity to volunteer before I was voluntold, to make it look better for me.
Very nice.
He was a good guy, real good guy. And so that was, and I also thought to myself, well, I always tried to look on the bright side of things. I wanted to get a sailboat. My wife and I enjoy sailing. And I thought, well, I can learn to navigate. I can learn all my my Coast Guard navigational stuff, and I'll ace the test when we get back from deployment. And so I was happy to be up there. I was the junior officer, the deck, and the conning officer, which when we're not in a stressful environment are easy for a person to handle both.
How many men aboard a destroyer like the Princeton?
The Princeton is a guided missile cruiser, but very, very similar to a destroyer. And approximately 450 people. Maybe, and all of those were male, except for approximately 4 female officers who were on board. And at the time on the bridge, there would have been an officer of the deck, myself, a helmsman, and a quartermaster, as well as a lookout on each bridge wing. There were other people stationed around the ship, but those were the people present on the bridge. So the first thing that happened that week in this event was that I got a call. The phone rang on the bridge, and it was Senior Chief Kevin Day down in the Combat Information Center. He was, I believe, he was the Air Defense Commander, sitting that console, and he's a Top Gun graduate from the controller side. So he's the best at what he does. And he basically called up to ask me what were my parameters for maneuvering the ship, and what were my boundaries. And I told him, well, I've got this box. I think we're on the south end of San Nicolas Island. I said, I have this box I have to stay in, and my only orders are don't get in the trough and wake the captain up or I'm fired. So basically just keep it smooth sailing, back and forth away from the shoals, let the anti-submarine folks ping all over and do their thing. And that was all I had to worry about. So it was a very easy night on the bridge for me. So when he started asking me to make course corrections so they could verify radar anomalies, it was pretty simple for me. I would just determine what the sea state was, where the trough was, and et cetera, and just make sure I didn't wake the captain up.
Okay.
So as the week progressed, Kevin kept calling me and asking me that. And even though later on I asked him what the heck if he got us chasing up there, I knew we were chasing UFOs, but I was given, you know what I mean? I was giving him heck later in the what do you got us running around here for a bit. But we knew that we were looking at something that was on radar, and we wanted to put eyeballs on it because we needed to make sure it was at least a real object in the sky.
Sure.
So that's why we were turning the ship, was to say that radar has it on for example, 010 heading. So put the ship on 010 and everybody keep looking that way until we see something. So we did that a lot of times. And at no time that I recall did anybody report anything. And I know this gets strange later on because I saw something and I didn't report it. But basically that week went by, and in the background, there were young men, younger petty officers running around, tearing systems down and putting them back together. There were emails flying back and forth from Nimitz to Princeton that included the entire chief's mess and officers. So we saw the chain of this investigation unfold. We saw the operations officers talking about temperature inversions and birds and balloons and chaff and flares and meteors and swamp gas and you name it. And finally, Senior Chief Day had gained enough information and had run enough tests and checks to tell the captain, sir, we need to tell Nimitz to send aircraft out there. And as air defense commander, he had that ability to do it. So a sortie was ordered, and we were lucky enough to get the gun camera footage back.
Yeah. Were you part of the group of people who the gun camera footage was screened for early on, or was this something that you saw later? And what was your reaction to it when you personally saw it?
So I believe it was the morning after the sortie returned. I was on the night watch and didn't know the sortie had gone out. And so in the morning when I woke up, I walked out into the chief's mess, and basically I got assaulted by the peanut gallery of my peers. Everybody kind of waiting for me to get up because I was known to sleep as late as possible. And they were all standing around with coffee going, smiling. And I said, what's going on? And I said to Kevin Day, who was sitting there smiling ear to ear, what's going on, man? Why are you guys all smiling? What the hell do you have us chasing around up there? And another one of the senior chiefs said, go check your email. It was like, don't talk to me until you go check your email. And so I went in the back and checked my SIPRnet, which is the secret terminal we had in the chief's mess. And there was the gun camera footage and the chain of emails. So the latest email
my gosh,
was an MPEG, and I opened it up, 5 chiefs standing behind me, and it was incredible. We saw exactly what we see on the video now. Other people say that they've seen a higher definition video, and I have a hypothesis about that given the data transfer and all of these other things, that it looked, I think if you got a CRT monitor and ran it on an old 1080 Dell, it's going to look better than it does on our big high quality screens. Now, I'm not an audiovisual expert. Perhaps someone will tell me how I'm absolutely wrong, but I do remember seeing what looked like little feet on the bottom, and it did seem more clear. And when they went through the phase, so what we got on the Princeton was a mashup of every phase change that the pilots that was witnessed on what may be a longer thing. Basically, they sliced it up, made it smaller for us, and shot it over to us. So we could see it change different phases of radar. And in one, it looked like it had a cloud of electrified plasma around it. And then it went to infrared, and then it was visible light. And in those, you could see what I have always described as perhaps pitot tubes. If you're familiar with older aircraft, it's basically, for folks who aren't, it's a little arm that sticks out with a hole in it, and it's essentially an alternator that the air goes in and keeps electronics running, just like the alternator on your car will.
Okay.
And I also considered perhaps they were loop antenna, as you might be familiar with aircraft as well. And so those were things that added to my thought that these could perhaps be a terrestrial advanced program, which I'm absolutely I'm absolutely positive they're not, now that I understand how fast they were moving, the 5 observables, and these other things. But you may be wondering that I lead up to the night before the gun camera footage came out.
Yes.
I had seen, Kevin called me on the bridge and was very vehement that we needed to put eyeballs on it, and I need a chief to do it too. And I said, Roger that, and went out on the bridge wings and talked to my guys and said, I need you to look and I need you to report back, etc. And then I went out and started scanning on the port side from the port beam up to the port bow. And at approximately 2,000 feet at 45 degrees, I saw 5 to 7 lights moving in a counterclockwise fashion towards the center of this formation that they were in. They're just this clump of themselves, but they would scoot around and then disappear one by one. And I watched this happen, and I lowered my binoculars and I turned to the sailor next to me and I asked him in a pretty salty manner, did you see that? And he said, yes, I saw that. And we kind of stood there for a minute, and then I went in went into the bridge, and I walked over to the phone, and I picked it up, and I looked at the clock, and I realized Kevin was off watch. I didn't think that the lieutenant that was standing in the console had any. I didn't know if he knew what was going on. I didn't think he would care. So I figured I'd just tell Kevin in the morning. So in the morning, we woke up, and there was the gun camera footage. And we never spoke about it again. We had a small laugh about it at the intel brief that night, but I was never called in to give any. I don't even know if I informed my chain of command what I had seen, to be honest with you.
There is something about watching that footage and seeing a motor source that allows a mechanism to move like a hummingbird or a dragonfly or a helicopter. Well, not even like a helicopter, like a hummingbird or a dragonfly, which for me signals a level of technology. Again, given the acceleration, the ratio of stopping, the ability to turn on a dime, that makes you feel like you are truly in the presence of other technology, and again, not advanced terrestrial technology. I'm speaking here completely subjectively here as somebody who is not a technically oriented person. But did you have a similar feeling? I mean, just looking at the physical movements of these things.
I completely agree with you. At the time, I was able to view the video again until I left the ship. But so when I left the ship in 2007, and I had gone back plenty of times and looked at that video again and wondered and weighed it. And like you, there's no way in heck that's a terrestrial program even now, and especially not in 2004. I just don't believe for a minute now, seeing the reports afterward, because I didn't know at the time that it had achieved hypersonic velocity. I didn't know, following the event, that Kevin had tracked them entering the water in the vicinity of Guadalupe Island, which was something that we investigated on the television show Unidentified. That didn't come out until afterward. So it's a shocking event. We have it, and somewhere the radar data exists too. And if hopefully these task forces will get the crowbar out and pry those out for us to see. But we can't let go of this event. I know a lot of people say to me, well, why are you so wrapped around the Tic Tac? I say, because it's got the best wealth of modern evidence that we have, and eyewitnesses, etc. I don't think it's the end all be all, but it's a great place to start.
Well, also, again, I'm going to call it a sentimental attachment. You were involved, and that goes beyond an intellectual curiosity. At a certain point, not long after, well, you left the service in 2015?
Yes.
Yeah. And within a few years, you were, along with Kevin and other men involved, speaking at conferences. We met in 2017 or 18 in Nevada, and the presentation that you guys gave was beyond riveting. We really felt some of what you were going through, or at least had that sensation. Did there come a time, once your name was associated this, that you started to feel that you experienced sarcasm, put downs, people who, they can't say, I don't believe you, and this is crazy. So they deal with their own anxiety by making offhand humor or attempts at it, or having fun at your expense, because kill the messenger if you can't attack the data. As well as people saying, I really appreciate your coming forward. I think it took some courage, and I respect you all the more for it. How did those two types of experiences start to impact on your life once you're a public person with regards to these events?
I have to say that the things that were hardest for me in the beginning were, of course, my family. And I don't mean my family here in my home, but my extended family. The hardest part for me was that I felt that something I had kept an eye on my whole life had gained validity.
Yeah.
And that I thought that based on the New York Times and Lou and other things, that there might be enough to have this conversation again. And it turned out that there really wasn't. The ridicule, and even when I say ridicule, I don't mean open ridicule, but just dismissing something that's important to a family member as something we're not going to talk about because it makes me feel funny, is dismissing me as a person. So that was heavy. But I have to say that what was really tough in the beginning is that because I had been offered to do another episode or a full episode or travel down to Mexico to film a little bit more than other folks had in just the interview state, that I was asked to remain relatively quiet and not participate in other projects. And so what you saw when other folks traveled and talked about this, I wasn't with them, and I wasn't able to participate with Kevin and other folks who went on to form UAPX. And there were some researchers, journalists, and podcasters who felt that I was somehow thought I was better than other people, or that I was holding something in reserve for someone else, when in fact I'll be honest with you, I was scared. And that might strike a lot of people as something laughable, but I don't understand. No. I don't, for all my
funny.
Get NDAs and lawyers, and I can't defend myself against that kind of thing. I'm a blue collar guy. I've recently got into it on Twitter with other folks calling us grifters constantly. And in 5 years, I've accepted $5,000 worth of offers and turned down countless others due to the ethics and other things surrounding it, because it's not important to me enough to sell my name out for. So pardon me for, getting a little.
I doubly appreciate that, Sean. Thank you for laying that out. I have parallel experiences coming at it from a different angle, and that kind of little BC AD that happened in December 2017, which when I read those articles, as somebody that grew up with the New York Times and at one point went archival over the top and spent time in the New York Times newspaper morgue and read every single article they had ever published on the subject of UFOs, flying saucers, unidentified aerial aircraft since 1947 to the present. I simply thought it was another flash in the pan of, okay, we've got some good coverage here, but they're going to go back to their 97% condescending coverage. It took me about a year to realize that something had really changed, and the other shoe wasn't going to drop, that it didn't matter anymore whether you were CNBC or Fox, or a registered Republican or a registered Democrat. People were coming together on this issue. At a certain point, you're now out of the service, and you can't walk away from this, and you co-found a think tank called skyfort.org. Can you tell us something about how this came to be and what Skyfort's mandate was?
When that article came out in 2017, I think what a lot of people don't realize is what it took for not only Leslie and Ralph and the other folks who wrote it, but for the folks in it, Lou Elizondo specifically and Christopher Melliner, who I'd like to single out, the risks that they took. Yes. Speaking about the subject, regardless of their positions prior to, just speaking about it at all from being within alleged rational mainstream government, they took a great number of risks. Yeah. And had they not done that, I don't know that I would be here today. I had incredible examples to follow. I think I may have lost the plot of the question a little bit and kind of meandered off.
How did it impact on you personally, having these positive criticism, positive comments and negative criticism? You've kind of answered. Really, what I'm curious about is skyfort.org. Yes. What were the circumstances that came together for you and your co-founder to make it a reality, and its mandate until it was dissolved?
Thank you. we had realized early on that we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know, as government folks, how do we do what no one else has done before, which is to get people to take this seriously. And at first, I believe that a lot of things were done right. You had to find a way to put it out. You had to find somebody with a voice and things like that. And I think Tom DeLonge and is still continuing as an advocate in this realm. Very huge voice. Now, granted, everything didn't work out there, but that was around the time that I arrived and made Lou and I hit it off and made a friendship. And at a certain point, I was, you can say, lucky or unlucky enough to be asked my advice. And I knew we needed more support. And I knew that where I came from in the Navy, that what he needed were a couple of good sailors and folks to help with the paperwork and to get the coffee made and to answer the phone and to help with email and things like that. And I came together with a couple of other researchers, one of them, Jake Mann, formerly of the channel It's Redacted, and a gentleman named Jesse Springer, who is a voice actor, and had a lot of great connections back in the Beltway and had created a network on his own of people interested in this subject with their phone numbers and their emails and all of these other things. And what we decided was to join forces and to support Lou and Chris and the other people that were trying to do this. And we made that fact known to them, and we met with them, and we said that this is what we want to do, and they accepted our help. And it was a tough year. It was a tough year to come back to my wife after working 8 or 10 hours a day and say that this was pro bono and this was in support of an advocacy effort. And no, we're not going to find a way to charge people money for this, because this matters to us. And the moment that we say, well, this is how much our time cost or consultation fees, people are immediately going to turn it against us. And so austerity will be the only way we can go forward with this. That wasn't easy, but I don't regret a minute of it. But the moment that we felt that we had achieved the goal we set out for, which was to spread the word to the point where relevant and rational authority was paying attention to a destigmatized subject, we were going to get out. And so we really had a talk. We knew that the hearings were coming up. We knew the language in the National Defense Authorization Act was hard hitting, that this was unlike anything ever before. And we decided to close our LLC down. And we had been offered, just as advisor, we had been offered advisory roles on burgeoning television programs that ended up in 6 and 7 digits if we had come on board. But I don't believe we would have done the subject a service, no offense to the people who have gone before us, but by creating entertainment around the subject any further. So we shut our doors down. That was tough for me. Skyfort mattered to me. Our logo, when we designed it, is as obvious as it gets. It is a black triangle coming out from behind a cloud. Whatever this is, we want to help unobscure it. We want to see these things in broad daylight, see the information, and understand what has been going on.
You know, as I've contemplated over the decades, that question of how could one engineer, for lack of a better term, disclosure in a manner that is extremely aware that, unlike you and I, and a lot of the folks that are watching and listening to us tonight, and many friends of theirs, the majority of people in public, in the world, and certainly in this country, are not quite ready for this. And it's not that there's anything wrong with them. They're overwhelmingly hardworking people doing their best to pay their bills, raise their kids, pay their mortgage, hope their Social Security by the time they need it, hope the world doesn't blow itself to hell. And this is not on their priority list. Most of us remember, you and I certainly had our own ways of going through that door at one point or another in our life, where you're saying, good God, what are they and what do they represent in so many words? A lot of people haven't even really gone there. They hear the term, open-minded, sure, I can accept the possibility, but I have other things to think about tonight. And if it was true, we'd probably all know about it anyway. You use a wonderful phrase that really stayed with me in describing some of Skyfort's mission, which was ontological shock. Can you tell us what you meant using that term in that context?
One of the first things that I felt that we needed to change about this subject was to take the urgent tone out of our voice when discussing it.
Mm-hmm.
So often when we bump into folks, they have limited time to discuss big ideas and big things. And so those elevator speeches tend to get pretty heated and to get pretty emotional.
Yeah.
So one of the first things that I really thought about was, what did I go through when all of this really scrambled my noodles? And I started thinking about just how much people go through when they're trying to wrap their heads around the idea that the world I have been given as truth is far different than the world that I have found through knowledge and through experience. Yes. And what was presented to me as a safe place to be is a more malleable place, and a place that challenges that my own psychology and memory and in paradigm. So without making it a total word salad, some of us lose our marbles when we get to the end of the rainbow, or when we encounter some of the more paradigm shattering conclusions. Yeah. Even in the last 5 years of hearing that there have been long-term studies on things like the 5 observables. Learning the 5 observables messed me up. Learning about them on the way out to Guadalupe Island at first seemed like a treat. Seemed like that I had been let to know something other people didn't know. It was neat, a feeling I got over real quick. But then after that, I realized I didn't really have anybody to talk with about it until this came out, later on. And I was like, well, but a 5 observable craft is a time machine.
Yes. Well said.
By any definition of our physics, and if that's not what it is, then we sure as heck don't know what time is, etc. But that in itself was like, well, where do I fit in a universe with time machines? And that's a version of ontological shock. Or perhaps other people look up in the night sky and finally realize it is so vast, there's got to be something. It may not be what you think, but there's got to be something. And so now the other finally enters their paradigm, and the other is scary.
It is. When you take it down to the baseline, I think it's fair to say every single fear that humans have is fear of the unknown. Yeah. Am I going to get cancer and die? Will the person I love stop loving me? Mm-hmm. Is the world going to explode? Will I get a raise at work? I hope the chicken is properly done at lunch. The unknown is where it all stems. And if there is a more universal, highly perfect symbol for the unknown, I think it's probably the truly anomalous UFO. And it doesn't always mean that, it's negative or scary, but there's only those two forces kind of going around, which is fear and courage, love and hate, expansion and contraction. And you can either embrace the mystery and have courage, or be at effect of it. What was it like for you just last month when there was this televised committee meeting in the House of Representatives that kind of blew it open and symbolically squeezed out toothpaste in a place it's never been, and it can't go back in the tube?
I'm so incredibly moved by what has been accomplished by so many dedicated people in the last 5 or 6 years. Not to mention, of course, the 40 to 8, the brackets of generational research, 40 to 80 years going back. Of course, we stand on the shoulders of giants here, but I'm incredibly proud of my part in it, and it's not something that I'm normally comfortable saying. Chief petty officers are not taught to be prideful. We're taught to try to show humility. But I'm incredibly proud of what myself, my friends, colleagues like honestly, Peter, colleagues like you who's shown, shoulders we frankly stood on a lot of times, whose research that we relied on, that we went back to, and wasn't always there wasn't always enough time for attribution always. If you know what I mean. Sometimes we had to take a lot of people's data, squish it into some ideas, and then, as I said, with that rational tone, get it in front of leadership and have the courage of conviction to say, yes, sir, this is real, and I stake my reputation on it. And
Sean, I can't tell you how much it's meant to me for you to be my first guest on the show in this new network. We're out of time. Where can people go to find out more about you and what you're doing?
They can follow me on Twitter at mintyhyperspace. If you need to reach me via Gmail, you can at mintyhyperspace@gmail.com. I have a website that is mintyhyperspace.com, but I haven't really updated it in a while and don't know that I'm going to keep it going or if I have a need for it. But I love to hear from folks, and I love to reach back when I can.
Can I ask you, given a reasonable period of time separating this night from the next, to return to the show and pick up on this conversation at another time?
Peter, I would love to come back and talk to you anytime. I still don't know if we hit it off because of your hearing loss that you were experiencing. But if you're going to keep listening, Peter, I'll keep talking.
And now hearing aids have made that a thing of the past. Listen, a big hug to you, my brother. Stay well. And thank you again. And for all of our guests, stay well, fight for what you believe in, and be kind to each other whenever possible. And we'll see you next week.